The tray hit the floor at 7:14 on a Tuesday night, and nobody looked at the broken glass. They looked at the tattoo. Emily Carter's sleeve had rolled up when she caught herself on the bar rail. Just a flash of ink on her left forearm, partially faded, the lines angular and precise in a way that didn't belong on a civilian. She yanked the sleeve back down immediately. Too late. Across the room, a retired Navy admiral named Harlan Voss had stopped walking mid-step. His drink was still raised. His face had gone completely still. "Who is she?" he said, barely above a whisper. And that one question was about to unravel 8 years of lies. If this story grips you from the first second, follow along until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Anchor House Grill sat at the edge of Seabrook, Maine, on a strip of waterfront that smelled like diesel fuel and low tide. It wasn't the kind of place people chose on purpose. It was the kind of place you ended up, traveling salesmen killing time before a ferry, fishermen too tired to drive home, the occasional tourist who'd missed the turn for the nicer spots down the coast. The decor was mounted striped bass and laminated menus and a jukebox that only worked if you kicked the lower left corner. Emily Carter had been working there for 14 months. She was 29, medium height, lean in the way that came from moving constantly rather than any particular effort. Brown hair that she kept back in a practical knot during her shifts. She wasn't unfriendly, but she wasn't warm in the way that maximized tips. She was efficient. She remembered orders without writing them down. She kept her section moving, and she stayed out of conversations she hadn't been invited into. The other servers liked her well enough. The regulars didn't bother trying to make small talk after the first couple weeks. There was something in her manner that quietly discouraged it. Not rudeness, just a kind of settled self-containment that most people eventually respected without being able to explain why. Donna, the shift manager, called it resting serious face and didn't mean it as a compliment. "You'd make twice the tips if you just smile a little more," Donna told her once, counting out the register. Emily had looked up. "I smile plenty." "Not at the tables." "At the tables I'm working." Donna had given up after that. The Tuesday that everything changed had started like every other Tuesday. Emily came in at 5, tied her apron, checked her section, and started running food before the 6 o'clock rush. The dinner crowd was thin for late October. A family in the back corner, 2 older couples near the window, and a table of 6 near the bar that had been loud since before she'd arrived. Military. She'd clocked that within 30 seconds of walking in, not because of the haircuts or the posture, though both were there. It was the way they occupied space, the particular brand of ease that came from men who were used to being the most capable people in whatever room they walked into. Junior enlisted, or maybe young O-grades, she guessed. Late 20s, early 30s. They'd been drinking for a while, not enough to be a problem yet. Enough to be enjoying themselves more than the situation warranted. She took their order without incident. They were polite enough, in the offhand way that assumed service was a transaction, and she was the vending machine. She didn't mind that. What she minded, 40 minutes later, was the comment. She'd been reaching past one of them to refill a water glass when the sleeve of her uniform, a short-sleeved black shirt the restaurant required, caught on the edge of his chair and rode up. The tattoo was on her left forearm, about 3 inches above the wrist. It had been there long enough that the color had faded from black to a deep charcoal gray, the lines still sharp but softened at the edges. It was a specific design, not decorative, the kind of symbol that meant something precise to a small number of people and nothing at all to everyone else. She freed her sleeve and straightened up, and that should have been the end of it. "Hold on." The one nearest to her was leaning forward, grinning. Early 30s, sandy hair, the particular look of a man who'd been told he was charismatic often enough to believe it. "Is that a military tattoo?" "It's a tattoo," she said. "What unit?" "None of your business." That got a few laughs from his table mates, and not the sympathetic kind. He wasn't embarrassed. He leaned back, spreading his hands in mock deference. "Hey, I'm just saying, I don't recognize it, and I know most unit insignias." He glanced at his friends. "Anybody recognize it?" Nobody did. "Maybe she got it off the internet," one of the others offered. More laughter. Emily set the water pitcher down on the edge of their table with exactly enough force to interrupt the noise without quite being called rude. You need anything else right now? Yeah, what's the tattoo? I already answered that. What's the... You said none of my business. That's not an answer. She looked at him for a moment. He had the settled confidence of someone who'd never actually been told no by someone who meant it. She recognized the type well enough. She'd spent years working alongside them, training with them, watching them figure out eventually that the world was larger and more complicated than their certainty allowed for. It's classified, she said, and walked away. The laughter that followed her back to the service station was louder this time. She heard the phrase probably a Navy wife, and then something else she didn't catch because she'd already stopped listening. Donna appeared at her shoulder. Everything okay over there? Fine. You sure? Because you've got that look. What look? The one that means you're 3 seconds from saying something. Emily pulled 2 plates off the pass-through. I'm always 3 seconds from saying something. It's called having a conversation. She headed back out to the floor. The family in the back corner had a kid who kept rearranging the sugar packets into configurations that were deeply important to him. The older couples were discussing what sounded like a contentious town meeting. The table of 6 had moved on to another topic and stopped looking at her, which was the outcome she'd wanted. She was in the middle of refilling the coffee for the couple nearest the window when the front door opened. She registered it the same way she registered most things, peripherally, quickly, cataloged and filed. Man, 60-something, well-built in the way that didn't fade entirely, even after you stopped training. Gray at the temples and through the close-cropped hair, a face that had been weathered by years of something more serious than weather. He wore civilian clothes, nothing that announced anything, but he held himself with the unconscious authority of someone who'd spent decades being the person other people waited on before moving. He stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room the way people with certain kinds of training always scanned rooms. His eyes passed over the family, the couples, the bar. And then they stopped. Emily was already looking away by the time he looked at her arm. The sleeve had stayed up slightly, just enough. And she pulled it down without thinking, the same reflexive motion she'd used since the ink was fresh. When she glanced back, he was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. His expression was entirely controlled, the way faces went controlled when the person behind them was working very hard to process something. He said something she couldn't hear from across the room. The hostess, a 20-year-old named Becca, who did not have a strong instinct for reading situations, pointed toward the bar seating. He sat down. He ordered a club soda. He didn't look at Emily again, at least not when she would have caught him looking. She kept working. The table of 6 got louder again around 8 o'clock, which was right on schedule for where they were in the drinking arc. Not belligerent, just more themselves. The sandy-haired one, she'd started thinking of him as Sanderson in her head, which wasn't his name, she just needed something, had clearly decided that the tattoo thing was going to be the bit of the evening. "Hey," he called out when she passed. "Still not going to tell us?" "Tell you what," she said, and kept walking. This became a pattern over the next 20 minutes. She handled it the same way she handled most irritants. She didn't engage, she didn't escalate, she gave them the minimum required attention and redirected her energy elsewhere. It wasn't hard. She'd once spent 6 hours lying motionless in a drainage ditch in complete silence. A group of tipsy junior officers in a coastal Maine restaurant was not a particularly demanding test of patience. What she hadn't anticipated was the man at the bar. She came around to check on him. He'd been sitting quietly, working on his club soda, apparently doing nothing at all. And when she set down a small bowl of mixed nuts he hadn't asked for, but the bar protocol required her to offer, he looked up at her. Up close, the weathering was more pronounced. There were old scars, small ones, the kind that healed into near invisibility but left a faint topography behind. His hands were steady on the bar, the kind of steady that wasn't inherent but practiced. "Thank you," he said. "Of course. Can I get you anything else?" He was quiet for a second. "I noticed your tattoo." She kept her expression level. "It's a tattoo." "I know what it is." Something shifted in the air between them. Not hostility, not threat. Something more like recognition, which was in some ways more disorienting. "I don't know what you mean," she said, which was true and also a lie, and somehow both at once. He didn't push it. He just nodded, the way people nodded when they were giving you room rather than backing off. Harlan Voss, he said. Used to be Admiral Harlan Voss, technically, but I've been retired long enough that it's mostly just Harlan. She absorbed that without showing it. Emily Carter. I know, he said. I mean, I didn't know it was you specifically, but I know what that tattoo means. I know the unit. I know what they did. He paused. I know what you'd have had to do to be part of it. From across the room, Sanderson's voice carried over. She won't even tell us what unit. Probably protective services, like bodyguard for a general's wife. More laughter. Emily watched something shift in Harlan Voss's face. Not anger, exactly. More like the expression of a man who'd spent 40 years making sure that certain things were handled correctly, and was now watching something be handled very incorrectly and calculating whether it was his business to intervene. They've been like that all night? He asked quietly. It's fine. That wasn't what I asked. It's fine, she said again, and something in her tone closed the subject. She'd learned that tone by necessity. It was the voice that ended conversations without hostility, that communicated, I have assessed this situation, and I am not requesting assistance without requiring the words. He let it go. She went back to the floor. It was 8:43 when Sanderson stood up to go to the bathroom and stopped at the bar on his way back, positioning himself at the far end, loud enough that he clearly intended the room to hear. Okay, I'll be serious for a second. I did 3 tours. I know my insignias. What she's got on her arm, I've never seen it, which means it's either fake or, he glanced at his friends, or she bought it at a tattoo shop because she thought it looked cool. His friends laughed. The couple near the window glanced over, startled. Emily was resetting a table with her back to the room. She did not turn around. What happened next she did not cause, did not invite, and had exactly nothing to do with. Harlan Voss set down his glass. He rolled up his left sleeve, slowly and deliberately, until the fabric was above his elbow. Then he held his arm out, resting it on the bar, visible to the room. The tattoo was older than hers. The lines had softened more. The color faded further toward gray. But the design was unmistakable. The exact same symbol. The same angular, precise configuration that meant nothing to anyone outside a very specific and very classified context. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. All at once. Sanderson was still standing at the end of the bar. His expression had changed in the way expressions changed when the brain received information it didn't have a framework to process. That's... he started. Yes, said Harlan Voss. Where did you... I think you know better than to finish that question. The silence in the room had weight to it now. Even the family in the back corner had quieted, the kid abandoning his sugar packets to look toward the bar, sensing something adult and important that he couldn't name. Emily turned around. She took in the scene, Voss's arm, Sanderson's face, the table of 5 all staring. And then she looked at Voss and something passed between them that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite resignation and wasn't quite anything that had a single word for it. Sir, Sanderson said, and his voice had changed. The easy bravado was gone. He was addressing Voss now with the careful register of someone who had suddenly become very aware of the distance between his rank and what he was looking at. With respect, who is she? Voss picked up his glass. Someone you owe an apology to. Sanderson turned to look at Emily. His face was doing a complicated thing. He stopped. I didn't know. No, she said. You didn't. She said it without heat, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. She carried a cleared tray back to the service station and started loading it with the next table's order and didn't say anything else. Her hands were steady. Her expression was the same as it had been all night. Contained, efficient, unreadable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Voss watched her for a moment, then set his glass down precisely and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, I need to ask you something, when you have a minute. She didn't answer immediately. She finished loading the tray. She delivered the order to the 2 older couples. She checked on the family and brought a side of ranch the father had asked for 15 minutes ago and forgot he'd asked for. Then she came back to the bar. I'm on break in 20 minutes, she said. He nodded. The rest of the shift moved in that particular time-dilated way where she was conscious of every minute while simultaneously doing everything she was supposed to be doing. The table of 6 paid their bill early, which was unusual. Sanderson left a tip that was significantly larger than normal. He didn't try to say anything else to her on the way out. Just met her eyes once at the door, with an expression she recognized. It was the look of someone recalibrating from scratch, who wasn't sure yet what the new map looked like. She understood it because she'd made that same recalibration herself, once, a long time ago, in a different life. At 9:15, she told Donna she was taking her break. And Donna, who had been watching the bar situation with narrowed eyes all evening and clearly wanted to ask about it, for once just said sure and let her go. Emily took her coffee to the back hallway that led to the staff exit, and Harlan Voss was already there, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had been patient for a very long time and had a little more patience left, but not much. "How'd you know?" she asked. "The tattoo." "You couldn't have seen it well enough to be certain from across the room." "No," he agreed. "But I was certain anyway. There are certain ways people hold themselves. Certain things that don't fully go away no matter how long you've been out." He paused. "I processed out 8 months after you disappeared from the records." She went still. "That's not—" "I know what the official record says. I've known what the official record says for years." He looked at her. "I also know what Marcus Greer put in the mission report." The name hit her like something physical. She hadn't heard it spoken out loud in a long time. She'd trained herself not to think it in sequence with other words that had meaning. Mission, extraction, spring 2018, Karev. The 4 men who had lived because someone had made decisions in the field that Marcus Greer had then decided never happened. "What do you know about the mission report?" she said, and her voice was carefully flat. "I know it says you weren't there," Voss said. "I know it says the 4 operatives extracted themselves with minimal medical support. I know it says Lieutenant Commander Greer coordinated the operation. That's the official record." "Emily." His voice was quiet. Not gentle exactly, but something adjacent to it. "There are 3 men alive right now who know what the actual sequence of events was. One of them contacted me 6 weeks ago. One of them has been working with federal investigators for the past 4 months. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded sheet of paper. And one of them signed an affidavit 2 weeks ago in which he specifically names you, your actions, and what Marcus Greer did afterward." She didn't take the paper. Not yet. "Why now?" she said. "Because Greer is up for a senior advisory position. Defense Department level. The kind of position that required an expedited background review, and the kind of review that opened files that had been very effectively buried." He paused. "And because the investigator who opened those files was specifically looking for irregularities, and what she found was a mission report that didn't add up in ways that only made sense if certain things had been removed." Emily looked at the paper in his hand. 8 years. She had spent 8 years building a life small enough not to draw attention, moving twice, working jobs that asked nothing of her training, staying out of systems that might flag her name. She had not made peace with it exactly, but she had made a kind of accommodation with it, the way you accommodated a wound that had healed wrong. You worked around it, you compensated, you didn't press on it. "If I talk to investigators," she said slowly, "that's the end of this. This being Seabrook, Maine. This being quiet." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said honestly. "It would be." She looked at the back wall of the hallway. There was a staff bulletin board with a rotation schedule and a notice about parking enforcement and a laminated sheet about what to do in a fire. The most mundane possible backdrop for the conversation she was having. "Who's the investigator?" she asked. "A woman named Sandra Kraft, Defense Department IG. She's been working classified records for 11 years. She's—" He paused, choosing the word carefully. "She's not the kind of person who opens something and then lets it close again." Emily thought about Marcus Greer in a Defense Department advisory position. She thought about the 4 men whose names she still knew, whose faces she could still render in perfect detail even after 8 years, who were alive because of decisions she had made in a drainage ditch, in a country that was never officially named in any document she had ever been allowed to see. She thought about the mission report that said she wasn't there. She took the paper. She unfolded it without reading it. Then she folded it back and held it in her right hand, and the paper was light, almost nothing, a few ounces at most, but the weight of the thing it represented was something else entirely. "I want to see the affidavit," she said. "I can arrange that. Before I talk to anyone, I want to read the actual document, not a summary." "That's reasonable. And I want to know—" She stopped, started again. "I want to know which one of them came forward." Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. "His name is Terence Malone. He's been carrying it for about 4 years, from what I understand. He said he didn't come forward sooner because he thought you'd chosen to disappear. He thought you were—" He paused. "He thought you were done with all of it and didn't want to be found." Emily absorbed that. Terence Malone. Sergeant First Class, the last time she'd known his rank. Quiet man, very good under pressure. Had a wife in Baton Rouge and a daughter he kept a photo of in his chest pocket. "He should have known better than that," she said, but her voice had lost some of its flatness. "Maybe so." She pushed off the wall and straightened up and looked at Harlan Voss directly for the first time since they'd been out here. "Tell the investigator I'll meet with her. Tell her I need 48 hours to think about the format, and I need her to come to me. I won't go to an office. And tell her—" She stopped again. From somewhere in the front of the restaurant, she heard the jukebox start up, the opening bars of something slow and old, the kind of song that played in every establishment like this one, in every coastal town like this one, the soundtrack to evenings that would mean nothing. "Tell her I remember everything," Emily said. "Every single detail, date, time, sequence. I have kept it exact because I knew that someday someone was going to ask me, and I was going to need it to be exact." Voss nodded once. He tucked the remaining papers back into his jacket. "Emily," he said. She was already turning back toward the door. "You should know," he said, "that Greer knows the investigation has been reopened. He doesn't know about you yet, but he's not going to stay uninformed for long, and when he finds out—" The door to the back hallway opened and Donna leaned through. "Your section's getting backed up." "I'm coming," Emily said. She walked back through the door, picked up her order pad, tied her apron strings one notch tighter, and walked out onto the floor. At table 7, the family's kid had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder. The 2 older couples were working through dessert. Outside the window, the harbor lights were coming on over dark water, and somewhere in the parking lot, headlights moved across wet asphalt, and Emily Carter stood in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night in a seafood restaurant in coastal Maine and thought about what it meant that Marcus Greer was about to find out she was still alive. The answer came to her quietly, without drama. It meant he had 8 years of lies to defend, and she had 8 years of waiting to spend, and the distance between those 2 things was going to determine everything that came next. She picked up a tray. She carried it out to the floor, her sleeves stayed down. She carried it out to the floor, and the night finished the way nights like that always finished. Quietly, without ceremony. The last table clearing out just before 10, Donna counting the register, Becca restocking the condiment caddies and humming something off-key. Emily wiped down her section. She rolled silverware. She did the closing side work with the same focused economy she brought to everything, and she did not think about Harlan Voss or Sandra Kraft or Terence Malone or Marcus Greer, or at least she trained her mind to the edges of those thoughts, and kept it there, the way you kept a wound from reopening by simply not pressing on it. She drove home at 10:47 in a 12-year-old Subaru with a heating system that worked on the passenger side only. Her apartment was 4 blocks from the water, second floor of a converted Victorian that had been converted poorly enough that the radiator knocked all winter and the bathroom door didn't fully close. She rented it month to month. She had rented every place she'd lived in for the past 8 years, month to month. It was one of those habits that looked like flexibility and functioned as something else. She sat at her kitchen table with the folded paper Voss had given her and a glass of water she didn't drink, and she looked at the paper for a long time before she opened it. It was a contact sheet. Sandra Kraft, Defense Department Inspector General's Office. A direct number, an extension, a secure email address, handwritten at the bottom in Voss's blocky script. She knows the shape of it. She just needs the details only you have. Emily put it face down on the table. She went to bed at midnight. She didn't sleep until close to 4, and when she did, she dreamed about nothing in particular, which was either a mercy or a sign that her brain had already started compartmentalizing and she'd long since stopped being able to tell the difference. The next morning, she called in to cover a double for a coworker and spent the hours between 7 and 9 doing the things she did when she was actively avoiding thinking about something. She ran 4 miles on the coastal path. She ate breakfast standing at her kitchen counter. She reorganized the contents of the cabinet under the bathroom sink with the focused attention most people reserve for important tasks. At 9:32, she picked up her phone, looked at the contact sheet, and called Sandra Kraft. The line rang twice. Kraft. The voice was clipped, professional, not unkind, but not wasting time either. Emily had an immediate and irrational sense that this was someone who ate lunch at her desk and didn't apologize for it. "This is Emily Carter," she said. "Admiral Voss gave me your contact information." A brief pause, just long enough to be meaningful. "Ms. Carter, thank you for calling." Another pause, shorter. "I want to say up front that I'm aware this conversation is not easy to initiate, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I appreciate that." Emily sat down. She hadn't realized she was still standing. "I was told you've been reviewing classified records." "I have. For the past 4 months, with a specific focus on a 2018 extraction operation. I'm not going to name it over this line." "I know which one." "I assumed you would." Kraft's voice was measured, neither sympathetic nor clinical. Somewhere in the register of someone who had handled sensitive things for long enough that sensitivity had become a practice rather than a feeling. "I also want to be transparent. This conversation isn't recorded. It's not official. And nothing you say right now constitutes a formal statement. I reached out to Admiral Voss because I needed someone with direct historical knowledge who could help me determine whether the discrepancies I was finding were clerical or something else." "They weren't clerical." "No," Kraft said. "They weren't." Emily pressed her thumb against the edge of the table. The wood was nicked from previous tenants, a series of small scars from someone else's life. "How much do you have?" "I have a mission report that doesn't internally cohere. I have a personnel roster for the extraction team that has 2 names redacted in a way that doesn't follow standard protocol. I have an after-action medical assessment that cites interventions that aren't attributed to any named provider." Kraft paused. "And I have a signed affidavit from Sergeant First Class Terrence Malone, which I'm prepared to share with you in full under a limited confidentiality arrangement if you're willing to meet in person." Emily looked out the kitchen window. The harbor was gray-green this morning, the kind of flat gray that meant the weather hadn't decided what it wanted to do yet. A single gull was working a piling near the public dock. "When and where?" she said. They met 3 days later at a rented conference room in a business center in Portland. Neutral ground, Kraft's choice, which Emily respected. Kraft turned out to be mid-40s, compact, with the kind of direct eye contact that felt less like aggression and more like efficiency. And she came alone, which Emily had specifically requested and half expected to be overridden. It wasn't. Voss was there too, sitting against the wall rather than at the table, which was either deference or strategy or both. Emily had already decided she trusted him enough to let it be both. Kraft set a folder on the table and slid it across without preamble. The affidavit was 11 pages. Emily read all of it. Terrence Malone had written it in the plain-spoken, compound sentence style of a man who thought in operational terms and had never been entirely comfortable with formal documentation. The facts came out in sequence, precisely the way they had happened, with the particular granularity of someone who had also spent years keeping something exact because he understood someday exact was going to matter. He wrote about the exfil point. He wrote about the 12-hour window compression that had turned a manageable extraction into a controlled emergency. He wrote about the 2 operators who had been hit before they reached the secondary egress, the kind of wounds that looked survivable and progressed fast enough that they weren't. And then he wrote about Emily Carter and what she had done for the next 4 hours, in terms that were specific and clinical and completely at odds with the official mission report's assertion that medical support had been minimal and unremarkable. He wrote, "She made decisions under fire that I have not seen any medical provider make in comparable conditions before or since. The 4 of us are alive because of what she did in that window. That is not an overstatement. That is an operational fact." And then he wrote what Marcus Greer had told him 2 days after they'd come home, in a brief and unremarkable meeting that had been framed as routine debrief. He wrote it verbatim, the way you wrote things you'd repeated in your own head enough times that they'd calcified into exact language. He said, "Carter's involvement in this operation will not appear in any official record." He said, "If anyone asks about medical support during the extraction, the answer is that standard protocols were followed by team members on site." He said, "This is not a discussion. This is how the debrief happened." Emily finished reading and set the document down on the table and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "He told Malone it was for operational security reasons," Kraft said, "that your name being connected to the operation created exposure for classified programs you were involved in." "That was a lie," Emily said. "Yes, we know that now." Kraft leaned forward. "What we believe, and what I need you to help me establish, is that Greer had a different reason, that the nature of your specific interventions, if attributed correctly, would have raised questions about the decision-making that led to the window compression, questions that would have pointed directly at him." Emily looked at her. "He made the call that moved the exfil window." "Yes. He moved it based on his assessment that the original timeline was operationally excessive. His words, in the preliminary planning document, which I have seen because I was there for the planning." "That document has been amended," Emily said. "I know. I figured that out about 6 months after I left, when I found a thread I could still pull." She paused. "I didn't pull it then because I didn't think it would go anywhere, and I wasn't prepared to be wrong about that." Kraft studied her for a moment. "What changed?" Emily looked at the affidavit on the table. "Malone," she said simply. "It wasn't the whole truth, and it wasn't not the truth. What had actually changed was that she'd spent 8 years telling herself the accommodation she'd made was sufficient, and 3 nights ago, in a back hallway in a restaurant in Seabrook, she had felt the exact specific weight of it in her hand when she took Voss's paper, and she had recognized it for what it was. Not peace, just distance, and distance had a way of collapsing." Voss spoke up from the wall. "Emily, what she needs from you is the planning document discrepancy in the medical sequence. Not your interpretation of it, the factual account, in order with every detail you've retained." "I know what she needs," Emily said without heat. "I know you do." The three of them sat there for a moment in the specific silence of people who understood each other's competence and were still figuring out how much to trust it. Then Emily said, "Greer is going to know within a week that someone outside the original team has given a statement, maybe sooner if he has access to the IG intake log." "He doesn't," Kraft said, "but you're right about the timeline. Once his background review team responds to our records request, it becomes visible." "What happens to his advisory appointment?" "It's suspended pending the outcome of the investigation." Kraft paused. "Assuming the investigation produces what I think it's going to produce." "It will," Emily said. "I need you on record." "I know." Emily looked at the affidavit one more time, then she closed the folder. "Schedule the formal interview for next week. Bring whoever you need to bring. I want a copy of every document you're working from, and I want my own legal representation present." "That's entirely reasonable." "And I want to read Greer's most recent personnel file before we sit down. Not his public record, his actual file." Kraft held her gaze for a moment. "I'll see what I can arrange." "That's not a yes." "No," Kraft said. "It's not. But it's also not a no, which is the most I can give you right now." Emily accepted that because it was actually an honest answer, and she'd learned to value those over comfortable ones. She drove back to Seabrook in the early afternoon, the coast road gray and salt-washed and almost empty, and by the time she got back she had 2 hours before her shift started. She spent the first hour sitting on the concrete steps outside her building with a cup of coffee she'd made badly because she was out of the good filters, watching a lobster boat work its way out of the harbor in the flat light. She was thinking about Marcus Greer. Not with anger. She'd processed the anger a long time ago, in pieces, in the particular piecemeal way you processed things you couldn't do anything about. What she was doing now was more like strategic assessment. He had known about the investigation for some period of time, which meant he had been managing it for some period of time, which meant he had done whatever he'd done to his records and his documentation and his version of events with the specific goal of withstanding scrutiny. The question was what he hadn't anticipated. The answer, she was fairly certain, was Malone. Not because Malone was unpredictable. He wasn't. He was one of the most steady men she'd ever worked beside. But because Greer had likely assessed him as someone with too much to lose by coming forward. A career. A family. The particular kind of complicity that comes from staying silent long enough that silence feels like a decision you've already made and can't undo. Greer had miscalculated the weight of it. Emily understood that too, in a different way. She finished the bad coffee and went to work. The shift was a Wednesday lunch to dinner, which meant the slow middle hours where the restaurant was mostly empty and the prep work stretched longer than it needed to. She stocked the condiments and reset the tables and let herself exist inside the ordinary mechanics of the job, which was something she'd genuinely learned to use. The way physical routine occupied enough of the lower mind that the upper mind could run on its own, processing, sorting, arriving at conclusions without the friction of forced thought. She was carrying a bus tub to the kitchen at around 4 when Donna caught her near the pass. "You had someone looking for you earlier," Donna said. Not suspicious, just noting it. "While you were on your split," Emily set the tub down. "What kind of someone?" "Man, 40s maybe. Civilian clothes, but the kind of civilian clothes that said he didn't usually wear them." Donna tilted her head. "He asked if you worked here by name, not, 'Is there a girl who looks like this?' By name. Emily Carter." Emily's hand stilled on the bus tub. "Did he leave anything?" "No, I told him you'd be back in for your dinner shift and he said he'd come back." Donna paused, and there was something in her face that was almost but not quite a question. She'd run this restaurant for 11 years and had a finely tuned instinct for when things were not what they appeared, which was part of what made her both a good manager and occasionally annoying. "You in some kind of trouble?" "No," Emily said. "Because you can tell me if you are." "I'm not in trouble, Donna." Donna looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "Okay," she said, and went back to the front. Emily stood at the pass for a moment. Man, 40s, civilian clothes that read wrong. Craftspeople? Possible, but Kraft had seemed like someone who did not send people without warning. Voss? She had his number. He would have called. Someone else's people. She picked up the bus tub and carried it through and did the rest of her side work without changing anything observable in her manner, because observable changes in manner were information, and she was currently in the position of having more information than she wanted and not yet being certain who else had it. At 6:45, the dinner crowd started coming in. She worked her section and watched the door. He came in at 7:12. She saw him immediately, which meant he was not trying to be subtle, which meant either he was bad at it or he'd decided subtlety wasn't the goal. 40s, as Donna had said, a face that was professionally unremarkable, the kind of face trained toward not being remembered. He was wearing a corduroy jacket that fit badly in the shoulders, which told her it wasn't his preferred jacket, which told her he'd made a choice about what he looked like tonight. He sat at a two-top near the window. Emily counted to 15, finished what she was doing at table 9, and then walked over. "Can I get you something to drink?" she said. He looked up at her. He had pale eyes, gray or green, the kind that registered things without telegraphing what they registered. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She wrote it down. "And I was hoping for a few minutes of your time," he said. His voice was quiet and very even. Not aggressive, not warm either. The register of someone who was used to delivering information and calibrated enough to understand that delivery mattered. "I'm working," she said. "I know. I'll make it brief." He reached inside the corduroy jacket and produced a card, which he placed on the table face up rather than handing it to her. A small, deliberate choice that gave her control of whether she picked it up. The card was plain. A name, a phone number, and beneath that a 3-letter designation she recognized. Not IG. Something else. Something that did not, under normal circumstances, involve itself in Inspector General investigations unless the scope of the thing being investigated had grown well beyond what the IG had initially understood it to be. Emily looked at the card. She did not pick it up. "My name is Dolan," the man said. "I'm not here officially. I was sent, informally, to let you know that the investigation you're about to participate in has attracted attention from our office, and that attention is not adversarial. But there are aspects of the classified record involved that go beyond what the IG has current visibility into, and we want to make sure that I don't surface things you'd rather stayed buried," Emily said. A pause. "That's one characterization? Is it an inaccurate one?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's incomplete," he said. "The more accurate version is that there are elements of the record connected to this operation that touch on active programs, and we need to understand the scope of what you're prepared to disclose before the formal interview proceeds." Emily looked at him steadily. "Who sent you?" "I'm not in a position to—" "That's a yes or no." He met her gaze. "Someone who knew about the operation," he said. "Someone who also knew about you and what you did, and who has had concerns about how this case has been handled for some time." She studied his face for the things people's faces gave away when they were being mostly honest. He was good at controlling the signals, but nobody was perfect, and she'd spent years in environments where reading people under pressure was operationally necessary. There was something in his posture that wasn't threat and wasn't apology, and was closer to a third thing. Something like the bearing of a man who'd been sent on a task he hadn't entirely agreed with, but was executing because he understood the institutional logic, even if he didn't love it. "I'll bring this to the people I'm working with," she said. "If they want to have a conversation with your office, that'll be their call. We'd prefer direct contact with—" "I understand what you'd prefer," Emily said. "That's my answer." He didn't push it. He sat back. She picked up his card. She looked at it once more. Then she put it in the pocket of her apron. "I'll bring you that coffee," she said, and walked away. She was halfway to the service station when her phone buzzed in her back pocket. She didn't check it until she was behind the service partition, and when she did, it was a number she didn't know. A text, no header. "Greer knows your name. He knows where you are. You have less time than you thought." She read it twice. She put the phone back in her pocket. She poured the coffee. Her hands didn't shake, which she noted with the detached interest of someone observing their own physiological responses professionally. They had shaken once, 8 years ago, in the hours after the extraction, when the adrenaline had finally metabolized and left her with nothing but cold and the specific silence of survival. They had not shaken since, under any circumstances she'd encountered. She walked the coffee back to Dolan's table. He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd spent the last 2 minutes reassessing his read of her. She set the cup down. "You need a few more minutes," she said. "Order some food." He looked at her. "Is something—" "Order some food and stay until I can talk to you properly. Do you understand?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of the kind that happened when someone who'd expected to be managing the conversation realized the conversation had its own manager. "What happened?" he said quietly. Emily pulled out her phone and showed him the text. He read it. His jaw tightened by a fraction. "When did you get that?" 90 seconds ago. He pulled out his own phone. "I need to make a call." "Do it outside," she said. "You're a customer having dinner. You're not a contact I'm meeting." He absorbed that. Then he stood, jacket on, walked outside with his phone, and she went back to the floor and served 3 more tables and brought bread to a foretop that had been waiting too long and did not, in any visible sense, appear to be a woman whose carefully maintained quiet life had just developed a serious structural problem. She texted Voss from the service station. "Someone found me, not yours, and Greer knows." She sent it and went back to work. Voss's reply came back in under 4 minutes. "Don't go home tonight." She looked at that for a moment, looked out at the restaurant floor, at Donna tallying tickets behind the host stand, at Becca arguing pleasantly with someone at the bar about the jukebox, at Dolan's empty table where the coffee was cooling and his napkin was folded neatly at the edge of the plate. He came back in a few minutes later and sat down and did not look at her when she came by, which was correct. But when she set down his check at the end of the meal, there was a folded note underneath, and when she opened it back at the station it read, "We can move you tonight, 1 hour, say the word." She stood very still for a moment. Then she folded the note back up, put it in her pocket next to his card, and went out to cover the last of her tables. Donna caught her by the host stand at 9:50. "You're somewhere else tonight. I've seen it twice. Long day. You want to talk about it?" "No." Donna studied her. "Okay." She reached under the desk and produced Emily's coat, which she'd apparently retrieved from the back. "You should take off. I'll cover the close." Emily looked at her. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." Donna held out the coat. "Take it." There was something in that simple exchange that hit differently than it should have. The uncomplicated practicality of it, the way Donna didn't ask for an explanation and didn't make it a moment, just handed over the coat and turned back to her tallying. Emily stood there for a second longer than was natural. "Thank you," she said. Donna didn't look up. "Be careful out there. It's going to rain." Emily walked out into the parking lot. The air was cold and salt-heavy, and the sky had that pre-rain density that pressed down on everything. Her car was at the far end of the lot, where she always parked it, under the light that had been burned out for 6 weeks. She'd noted that when she took the job. She'd parked there anyway because the habit of occupying the observable edge of a space was older than the burned-out light. She unlocked the car. She sat in it without starting it. Voss. "Don't go home tonight." Dolan. "We can move you tonight." Marcus Greer, somewhere she couldn't currently see, knowing her name, knowing Seabrook, with 8 years of lies to protect, and the particular desperation of a man who had finally looked up and realized the ground he was standing on was not what he'd thought it was. Emily put her key in the ignition. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Not the same one as before, different, but with the same format. The clean, non-local prefix that meant routed line, meaning professional, meaning this was not Greer panicking and making calls himself. This was someone who worked for Greer, or worked adjacent to Greer, who was competent enough to route the communication, but not quite competent enough to stay silent when silence was the smarter option. The text said, "The Admiral should know that the man he's protecting isn't who he thinks she is. Records from 2019 prove she went AWOL. We have documentation." Emily read it 3 times. Her first reaction was something she identified with the detached precision of someone doing a systems check, as cold fury, not hot, not explosive, but the deep and very quiet kind that settled in the chest and stayed. Her second reaction was professional assessment. Greer wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building a counter-narrative. He had documentation, real or fabricated, she didn't yet know, and he was going to use it. And the timing of this text meant he was using it now, which meant he was more scared than she'd expected and moving faster than Sandra Kraft had anticipated, which meant the investigation was about to become a war. She started the car. She pulled out of the lot and drove 2 blocks before she pulled over again and called Voss. He picked up on the first ring. "I got a text," she said. "Greer's team is claiming I went AWOL in 2019. They say they have documentation." A silence. Then, "Do they?" "There's a gap in my record from 2019. I was operating on a secondment that wasn't officially logged at the time. It can be made to look like something it wasn't." "Can it be disproved?" "Yes, but not quickly and not without surfacing information that implicates 3 other people who didn't sign on for that." Another silence. "Emily, how bad is this?" She looked out the windshield at the empty street, the rain just starting now, exactly as Donna had predicted, small drops hitting the glass one by one. "It's bad," she said. "He's not trying to make this go away anymore. He's trying to make me the story." Voss was quiet on the line for 3 full seconds, which was long for him. "Where are you right now?" 2 blocks from the restaurant. Pulled over." "Don't go home." "I mean that." "You said that already." "I'm saying it again because I need you to actually hear it this time and not interpret it as a suggestion." His voice had changed, still controlled, but with something underneath it now, the particular edge of a man who had spent 40 years reading threat levels and had just revised his upward. Greer moving this fast means someone told him the interview was being scheduled, not speculated, told him, someone inside the process. Emily absorbed that. Kraft? Not Kraft. Someone adjacent. An intake clerk, a scheduling coordinator, Someone who saw a records request come through with his name on it and made a phone call they shouldn't have. He paused. It happens. It's a problem, but it happens. So he's had more time than we thought. Potentially, yes. She looked out as the rain, heavier now, the street ahead of her going blurred and dark. The AWOL documentation. If it's fabricated, how good is it? Depends on who made it. Greer had access. 2019, I was on that secondment. It was a joint tasking, 2 agencies, very narrow paper trail. If he got to the right person and had 4 months, he could build something that would take 6 weeks to fully disprove. 6 weeks he'd use to bury Kraft's case in procedural challenges. Yes. Voss made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then, I'm calling Kraft tonight. She needs to know before morning. A pause. Emily, do you have somewhere you can stay? I'll figure it out. That's not, I'll figure it out, Harlan. She used his name deliberately, the way you use someone's name when you needed them to hear the thing under the sentence. I've been managing this alone for 8 years. One more night isn't the variable that breaks it. A pause, longer this time. Okay, he said. Keep your phone on. She hung up. She sat in the car for another minute, the rain working itself up to something serious, and she ran through her options with the same methodical efficiency she'd have used to assess any constrained situation. Resources available, exposure points, time window, objective. The objective was staying functional and accessible until Kraft could get in front of this fast enough that Greer's counter-narrative didn't have room to take root. She drove to a motel 12 miles up the coast that she had specifically not stayed at before, and paid cash for one night and brought nothing from the car except her phone and her wallet. The room smelled like old cigarettes and synthetic carpet, and she didn't care about that. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her phone. There were 2 more texts from the unknown routed number. She didn't open them. She texted Dolan instead, because of the options currently available to her. He was the one whose resources were most immediately operational and whose institutional interest most aligned with not letting this become a public catastrophe. She wrote, "Need to talk, not on a routed line. How fast can you get secure?" His reply came back in 6 minutes. "Already am. Call when ready." She called. "The AWOL documentation," she said without preamble. "We know about it." His voice was flat, not surprised, which told her his office had been tracking Greer longer and at closer range than she'd been told. It was filed through a records amendment request in October. We flagged it at the time as anomalous, but couldn't move on it without triggering a disclosure we weren't ready for. October. That was 2 months ago. He started building it before Kraft's investigation became visible, which means either he has a better internal source than we thought, or he initiated it preemptively because he knew the advisory appointment would generate a background review, and he wanted the counter-narrative already in place before anyone started looking. She thought about that for a moment. That's not panic. That's preparation. No, Dolan said. It's not panic, which is what worries us. What's in the documentation specifically? A travelogue discrepancy, an absence of record for a 22-day period in March 2019, and a witness statement from a junior officer who reported observing Carter, observing you, in a location that was inconsistent with your assigned duties during that period. The witness statement. The name attached to it is a Lieutenant Petra Wills, currently stationed in Okinawa. Emily was quiet for a moment. I don't know a Petra Wills. That's potentially significant. It's more than potentially significant. If I've never interacted with this person in any documented or undocumented context, the statement is fabricated outright, not distorted from something real. That's a different level of exposure for whoever signed off on it. Yes, Dolan said. It is. Can your office verify her assignment dates? Already in progress. How long? Days, not hours. Emily pressed her thumb against the motel nightstand, the laminate cold and slightly tacky. He's going to try to get Kraft's interview suspended pending a review of my service record. If he files the right motions in the right order, he can buy 2 to 3 weeks minimum. That's our assessment as well. So the interview needs to happen before he can file. Kraft is aware. She's been trying to reach you. Emily checked her phone. There were 2 missed calls from an unfamiliar number, that when she looked at it now matched the exchange from Kraft's contact sheet. She'd missed them while she was driving. I'll call her now. One more thing. Dolan's voice shifted slightly, the controlled register acquiring a quality she hadn't heard from him yet. Not hesitation, but something adjacent. There's a second component to this that Greer's team appears to be preparing. Our intercept picked up communication in the last 6 hours suggesting they plan to surface a claim that the medical interventions attributed to you by Malone's affidavit were, in Greer's framing, contraindicated and potentially harmful. That the outcomes were positive despite your interventions, not because of them. Emily went still. He's going after the medicine, she said. He's going after the medicine. She sat with that for a moment. The particular calculus of it was almost elegant in its ugliness. If he could create enough credible doubt about the quality of her medical decisions in the field, the affidavit's central claim became contested. Malone became a well-meaning but potentially mistaken witness, rather than a corroborating source, and the entire evidentiary structure shifted from Greer lied to this is a disagreement between accounts with no clear resolution. He would need a medical expert to make that case, she said. He has one, a Dr. Wallace Pruitt, retired military surgeon, who Greer has apparently had a professional relationship with for some time. What Pruitt would need to make the claim hold up is the actual clinical record of what I did. Sequence of interventions, timing, patient status at each point. The clinical record was part of what he buried, yes, which means Pruitt will be working from reconstructed scenarios, not documentation. She exhaled. Which means it can be challenged. But to challenge it credibly, I need someone who can speak to both the tactical context and the medical standard of care under those specific conditions. Not just a clinician, someone who understands what field medicine looks like when the field is a compromised exfil site with a compressed window and 2 critically wounded operators. Do you have someone like that? She thought about it, ran names through her head the way she ran inventory, fast, categorical, honest about gaps. Possibly, I need to make a call. Tonight? In the next hour, yes. Dolan was quiet for a moment. Miss Carter. The formality was back slightly. The register of someone delivering a paragraph they'd chosen carefully. My office has institutional reasons for wanting this resolved cleanly. I want to be transparent about that, so you understand our interest isn't purely your vindication. I know. But I also want to be transparent that the people I work for have known for some time that what happened to your record was wrong, that it was allowed to stand because the alternative required surfacing information that created other problems, and that there are people in that building who are uncomfortable with that decision in retrospect. Uncomfortable, she said. Yes. That's a very mild word for what happened. It is, he said. I know. She hung up and called Kraft. Kraft answered on the first ring, voice carrying the particular texture of someone who had been awake for too long and had more still to do. Carter, I've been trying to reach you. I know. I was in motion. Greer filed a preliminary motion at 6 o'clock this evening to have the investigation suspended pending a service record review of the primary witness, you. The filing cites the AWOL documentation and questions the reliability of any testimony from an individual with unresolved disciplinary flags. When does it have to be answered? We have 72 hours before a review board is convened to assess whether to proceed. Kraft's voice was even, but the efficiency of it had a slightly compressed quality, the way voices got when someone was managing a larger amount of pressure than they were showing. Which means we need to move the formal interview to tomorrow morning, not next week. Tomorrow. What time? 8 o'clock. Same location in Portland. I've already contacted Malone. He'll be present via secure video. I need you there in person with whatever documentation you can bring. I don't have documentation with me. I didn't go home tonight. A pause. Smart. Okay, come as you are. Your verbal account is the primary thing I need. She paused again. Can you give me a summary right now over this line of what you believe the core of Greer's AWOL fabrication is built on? March 2019. I was on a secondment, a joint tasking between my unit and another agency I can't name on an open line. The secondment lasted 22 days. The formal paperwork for it was held at a classification level above my unit's standard documentation, meaning my CO at the time would have had a verbal authorization, but no written record he could produce on request. Is your CO still accessible? He died in 2021. The silence this time was a different shape. Okay, Kraft said, then the witness statement, Wills. I've never served with or encountered anyone by that name. Then the statement is either entirely invented or Greer found someone willing to sign something misleading enough to be technically defensible. Given what Dolan told me about her current assignment, I'd start with the first option. Dolan. Kraft's voice shifted in a way that communicated she knew exactly who Dolan was and had feelings about his involvement that she was choosing not to express right now. He made contact with you. Last night at the restaurant, then tonight by phone. What did his office offer? Nothing formal, information mostly, and the offer to move me, which I didn't take. A sound that contained multiple things. All right, tomorrow at 8. Don't be late, and don't call anyone you don't absolutely trust between now and then. Understood. She was about to hang up when Kraft said, Carter. Yeah. The medical competence angle. Greer's team is going to push hard on it tomorrow, either in their response to our proceedings or through a back channel to the review board. I need you to be able to walk through the clinical sequence in detail, not defensively, factually, like you're briefing a trauma team, not defending yourself. I can do that. I know you can, Kraft said. That's why I want you to do it that way. She set the alarm for 5:30 and didn't sleep well, which she'd expected. The motel's radiator made an intermittent sound like someone tapping a pipe, and she spent 2 hours in the specific half-sleep of high-alert rest, aware of the room and the sounds outside it, her mind cycling through the clinical sequence the way Kraft had asked her to walk it, in order, by the facts, the way you'd brief someone who needed the information to make a decision. She ran through it 4 times before she let herself stop. At 5:45, she got up and stood in the narrow bathroom under a shower that ran hot for exactly 4 minutes and then went lukewarm, and she thought about Wallace Pruitt and what a fabricated clinical challenge would need to be credible. And by the time she was dressed, she had a clearer picture of where the argument was weakest. The weakest point was the tourniquet decision. Operator Rivas, she still thought of him by last name, the way you thought of people you'd worked beside under pressure, had presented with a femoral injury that was, by standard field triage protocol, a tourniquet indication. Straightforward. The kind of decision that got made in under 30 seconds in any competent trauma response. What complicated it was that Rivas was also showing early signs of compartment syndrome in the same limb, which meant a standard tourniquet application would have accelerated tissue compromise in a way that might have cost him the leg. What she had done instead was a manual pressure protocol combined with a wound packing technique that was, at the time, at the outer edge of accepted field practice. Not outside the literature, but not yet standard training. The kind of approach that a military surgeon with a conventional background could frame as experimental and irresponsible without being technically dishonest about it. Rivas had kept the leg, but Pruitt didn't need to argue outcomes. He just needed to argue that the decision was clinically unjustified in the moment, and outcomes were not retrospective justification for methodology. Emily had been making that argument to herself for 8 years because she'd known, the moment she made the call, that it was the kind of decision that couldn't be defended in a vacuum. It could only be defended by someone who understood the alternative and what it would have meant. She needed someone who understood the alternative. She made the call she'd been thinking about since the conversation with Dolan. The phone rang 5 times. She thought it was going to voicemail. Then, "Who is this?" The voice was rough with sleep, female, carrying the particular edge of someone who slept light and came awake fast. Emily remembered it exactly. She'd been hearing it in her head since the previous night when she'd run names. "Dr. Osai, it's Emily Carter." A pause, brief and sharp, then, "Jesus." A beat. "Sorry, Carter. I know, it's been a long time. Where are you calling from?" "Maine. I need to ask you something." "At 6 a.m. "Yes." Another pause. She could hear movement on the other end, sheets, a lamp being clicked on. "Doctor." Amara Osei had been attached to their unit as a surgical consultant for a 14-month period overlapping the 2018 extraction. She'd left the military the year after to run a trauma surgery program at a civilian hospital in Cleveland. She was not connected to any of the subsequent record issues, which was partly why her name had surfaced as a possibility. She was clean, she was credible, and she had reviewed Emily's clinical notes from the field with enough frequency that she understood exactly what the Rivas decision had involved and why. "The Rivas case," Emily said. "I need to know if you'd be willing to speak to it." The silence this time was longer. "Carter," Osei said carefully, "that file is classified." "I know. I'm currently part of a Defense Department IG investigation that is, as of tonight, also partly under the oversight of another agency. The classification level of the file is manageable if you come in voluntarily. Kraft, the IG investigator, can arrange a deposition under appropriate clearance conditions." "What exactly is being disputed?" "Greer is bringing in a surgical consultant to argue that my intervention with Rivas was contraindicated, experimental, potentially harmful." A sound that Emily recognized as Osei pressing her lips together, which she did when she was restraining a more direct response. "He's going to argue that the wound packing protocol was irresponsible." "Yes. While Rivas is walking around on both legs." "The argument isn't about outcome. It's about whether the decision was medically justified in the moment. And Greer wants someone to say it wasn't." "Yes." Another long pause. Emily sat on the edge of the motel bed and let Osei think. She'd learned the patience for this. The specific patience of not filling silence with persuasion when persuasion was the wrong move. Osei was not someone you moved by pushing. She was someone who arrived at decisions by working through them properly, and the best thing you could do was stay out of the way of that process. "I reviewed your notes," Osei said finally. "After the fact, while you were still technically in the record." "I know. I wrote an addendum, a clinical addendum to your field documentation, assessing the wound packing decision in the context of his presentation at the time. I wrote it because what you did was at the edge of the literature, but it was the right call, and I wanted someone to have put that on paper." Emily's breath shifted. "Where is that addendum?" "I don't know. I submitted it through the standard documentation channel, and I never received confirmation that it was received. I assumed it was filed." "It wasn't in the official record." "Of course it wasn't," Osei said with a flatness that said she was not surprised, had probably always known on some level, and had made her own accommodation with it. "So he buried that too." "We can't confirm that without locating the original submission record. But if the submission record exists, it proves two things: that the documentation existed and that someone actively removed it." Osei exhaled. "Carter, what are you asking me to do, specifically?" "Come to Portland tomorrow. Sit in the room. Let Kraft ask you about the Rivas case on the record, and if your original addendum can be located, confirm its contents." A pause. "I have a board meeting tomorrow. I know this is... I'll reschedule it." The words came out with the particular decisiveness of someone who'd made the decision before they finished speaking, who had probably known since she'd heard Emily's voice what the answer was going to be. "Send me Kraft's contact information. I'll get there by 7:30. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I should have done something about this years ago." A beat. "Where are you staying?" "A motel." "Which motel?" "Why?" "Because if Greer knows you're in Seabrook and you didn't go home, he's going to spend tonight figuring out where you went, and by morning his people will have narrowed it down." Osei's voice had taken on the flat precision of a woman who had also spent time in operational environments and retained the relevant habits of thought. "You should move in the next 2 hours." Emily looked at the room, at the tacky laminate nightstand and the rain-gray window and the door she'd wedged shut with a chair because the security bar was broken. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "Go somewhere he can't predict. Not a chain, not close to the highway." "Okay." "And Carter," Osei's voice shifted slightly, "I need you to know, I always thought someone would eventually come back to this. I thought it would be sooner. I'm sorry it took this long." Emily sat with that for a moment. It was not the first apology she'd received in the last 48 hours, and it would probably not be the last, and they all carried the same basic shape. a recognition of the gap between what should have happened and what did, expressed by someone who understood the gap clearly and had lived alongside it. "See you at 7:30, she said, and hung up. She moved to a different motel at 2 in the morning, smaller, older, cash only, the kind of place that kept no digital records because the owner ran it on a ledger that was probably 40 years old. She paid for one night, took the room at the end of the ground floor, and set the chair against the door, and this time she slept. The Portland conference room looked different in the morning, harder edged, the gray October light coming through the north-facing windows without warmth, the table cleared of the previous session's documentation and reset with fresh files. Kraft was already there when Emily arrived at 7:50, and she looked like someone who had also not gone home, or who had gone home briefly and returned, which amounted to the same thing. Osei arrived at 7:28, which was technically before Emily, and was sitting across from Kraft with a coffee and a tablet and the bearing of a woman who had done nothing but prepare for the previous 12 hours. She and Emily looked at each other across the room for a moment. "You look exactly the same," Osei said. "You don't," Emily said. "That's because I've had a harder decade." She said it without self-pity, just as information. Voss arrived at 5 to 8. Dolan was not there, which told Emily that his office had made a calculation about visibility that she understood even if she didn't fully agree with it. At 8 o'clock, Kraft called the session to order and turned on the recording equipment and placed a small placard on the table that read the date, her name, and the case designation, and Emily sat down across from her with her hands flat on the table and began. She started at the beginning of the day, the timeline compression, the revised exfil window, the communication breakdown that had left them working with outdated extraction intelligence. She went through it in order, the way she'd rehearsed it in the motel at 5 in the morning, clinical and precise, and she did not editorialize, and she did not allow her voice to carry anything that would read on a recording as defensiveness. Kraft listened without interrupting. Osei listened with a notepad open, occasionally writing something. Voss sat against the wall as he had in the previous meeting, and said nothing. She reached the medical sequence at 9:15 and walked through it with the same precision. Patient presentation, vitals, clinical assessment, decision tree. She described the Rivas call exactly as she had made it, including the reasoning, including the alternative she'd rejected and why, including the outcome. Kraft asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them good. Emily answered all of them without pausing. Then Kraft turned to Osei. "Dr. Osei, you reviewed Ms. Carter's field notes in the period following this extraction." "I did." "And the clinical addendum you referenced in your preliminary communication last night." "I submitted it through the standard documentation channel in June 2018. I have the submission reference number." Osei slid a printed page across the table. "I kept it because I keep submission records for all formal documentation I file, standard practice for any clinical addendum in a military context." Kraft looked at the page. Then she looked up. "This reference number, if traceable, will show the submission was received." "Yes, and if the addendum is not in the case file despite being received, that's not a clerical issue." "No," Kraft said. "It's not." Emily watched Kraft write something on the top of her notepad, and the handwriting was too small to read across the table, but the motion had the quality of someone marking something significant, the moment when a document became a weapon. At 10:40, a knock on the conference room door. Kraft's assistant opened it and leaned in, said something quietly. Kraft's expression did not change, but she set her pen down with a specific deliberateness. "We need to take a short break," Kraft said. Emily looked at her. "What happened?" "Greer filed an emergency petition 40 minutes ago, not just to suspend the investigation." Kraft paused, and the controlled quality of her voice had something new in it. Not alarm exactly, but the register of someone recalculating at speed. "He's filed a formal counter-complaint alleging that this investigation is being conducted in bad faith, that evidence has been improperly obtained, and that one of the witnesses," she looked at Emily, "is currently operating under a false identity." The room went quiet. Voss straightened up from the wall. "A false identity," Emily said. "His filing claims that Emily Carter, the identity you've been using for 8 years, was constructed." that your legal name prior to 2018 was something else, and that the person conducting this investigation has been misrepresenting her identity to federal investigators. Emily sat very still. She did not look at Voss. She looked at Kraft directly, and she kept her voice completely level. "That's not accurate," she said. "I know that," Kraft said. "But the claim triggers a mandatory identity verification process, which means everything we've done this morning is administratively frozen until your identity is formally confirmed through independent federal records." "How long does that take?" "Standard process, 3 to 5 days. Kraft paused. "Greer's attorneys will use that window to file the suspension motion on the underlying investigation, which gives him a week, at minimum." Osei was watching Emily from across the table with the careful attention of someone who was trying to read what was under the surface. Emily put both hands flat on the table. She thought about the false identity claim, where it could have come from, what documentation would be needed to make it stick even temporarily, what Greer would have needed to access or fabricate to generate a claim specific enough to trigger the verification protocol. And then she thought about something else. Something she had not thought about since she'd gotten the text in the restaurant parking lot the previous night, because she'd been managing everything else, and this particular thread had stayed at the edge of her attention. The secondment in 2019. The 22-day gap. The documentation held at a classification level above her unit's standard records. The only people who could access that documentation were the people who had originally authorized the tasking. And the only people who had authorized it were, by her count, 3 individuals, 2 of whom were no longer in a position to corroborate or deny anything, and one of whom was not someone she'd spoken to in 8 years, and had not, until this moment, considered as a variable. She looked at Kraft, who reviewed the identity claim before filing. It would have gone through Greer's legal team, and who in a federal capacity reviewed it and determined it was sufficient to trigger the verification protocol. Someone had to make that call. Kraft's expression shifted slightly. A duty officer in the DOD Legal Affairs Office. A Colonel Hargrove. Emily looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Voss. And Voss, for the first time since she'd known him, looked like a man who had just understood something he didn't want to understand. "Harlan," she said quietly. "Do you know that name?" He said nothing for 3 full seconds. "Yes," he said, "I know that name." "How?" He looked at the table. Then he looked up at her with the expression of a man who was about to say something that cost him something real to say. "Hargrove was one of the 3 people who authorized your secondment in 2019. The room did not change. The light through the north windows was the same flat gray. Osei's notepad was still open. Kraft's pen was still down. Everything was exactly as it had been, but the shape of the problem had just shifted in a way that made every calculation Emily had run in the last 48 hours incorrect in its fundamental premise. Because if Hargrove had authorized the secondment, Hargrove had access to the documentation that proved the AWOL claim was false. And if Hargrove had reviewed Greer's identity petition and allowed it to proceed, then Hargrove was not a neutral party in a bureaucratic process. Hargrove was working with Greer, which meant the secondment documentation, the only thing that could cleanly disprove the AWOL fabrication, was in the hands of someone who had every reason to make sure it was never produced. Emily looked at Kraft. "The submission reference number OC gave you," she said. "Get your records team on it right now. Not this afternoon. Right now. Because if Greer's team understands what that number can prove, they are already trying to close that door." Kraft was already reaching for her phone when it rang first. She looked at the screen. She picked it up. Emily watched her face while she listened, and Kraft's face was controlled and professional and gave almost nothing away, and the almost was a single line between her eyebrows that deepened by 1 increment during the call and did not go back. She hung up. "The addendum submission record," she said. "Our records team just checked the federal documentation archive." "And?" Emily said. Kraft looked at her steadily. "It's been accessed and flagged for restricted review within the last 4 hours." The words landed in the room and nobody moved for a moment. Flagged for restricted review. In the last 4 hours. which meant sometime between 2 in the morning and now, someone with the access level to reach the Federal Documentation Archive had found Osei's submission record and put a wall around it. Not deleted it. That would have been too obvious, too clean. The kind of action that left an absence where there should have been a presence, and absences were their own form of evidence. Instead, they'd flagged it. Restricted access. The bureaucratic equivalent of a locked door that also announced to anyone paying attention that someone had recently decided this particular room needed a lock. Kraft was already on her feet. "I need my records team lead on a direct line right now," she said to her assistant in the doorway. "And I need the archive access log for that submission record. Every access event, timestamp, user credential. Tell them I want it in 20 minutes. The assistant disappeared. Kraft looked at Emily. How did they know to look for it? They didn't know about the addendum specifically, Emily said. But when Osei was brought in, someone would have flagged her name against the relevant case files. Standard background pull. If Greer's team had access to incoming witness notifications, which they shouldn't, Emily agreed. But if they did, Osei's connection to the 2018 operation would have led them straight to any documentation she'd submitted connected to that period. Kraft pressed her lips together. Hargrove. He had the clearance. He knew the secondment records. If he's been working with Greer's team, feeding them information about what the investigation was finding, then he's not just a co-conspirator in the cover-up, Kraft said. He's actively obstructing a federal investigation. Yes, Voss said from the wall. Hargrove was DOD legal affairs for 23 years. He has relationships across the documentation infrastructure. If he wanted to make something difficult to access, he could do it quietly. He already did, Osei said. She was still at the table, hands folded, watching the room with the kind of stillness that came from spending years in operating theaters. The ability to stay completely functional in a crisis while the people around her moved. He flagged the record. He didn't delete it, which means either he couldn't delete it at his access level or he didn't want to. Why wouldn't he want to? Emily said. Because deleted records leave deletion logs. Restricted records just look like procedural caution. Osei looked at Kraft. But restricted records can be unrestricted by someone with the right authority, and the access log you're pulling will show exactly who put the flag on and when. Kraft nodded. Which gives us a paper trail directly from the restriction to whoever ordered it. Right. So if Hargrove flagged it, and the log shows Hargrove's credentials, then we have him on obstruction regardless of whether we can get into the record itself. Emily looked at Osei for a moment. You've done this before. Done what? Watched something get buried and then figured out how to dig around the burial. Osei held her gaze. I had reasons to learn how. The room reconfigured itself around that statement without anyone saying anything else about it, and Emily filed it in the category of things she understood well enough not to need explained. Kraft's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway. Voss moved from the wall to the table for the first time, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the deliberateness of a man who was tired and had decided to stop performing the kind of alertness that required standing. He looked at Emily. I should have told you about Hargrove from the beginning, he said. You didn't know he was involved. I knew he had access to the secondment record. I should have flagged it as a risk. Emily looked at him for a moment. He was being honest, which she respected, and he was being harder on himself than was quite accurate, which she also understood. You flagged what you knew. You didn't know what you didn't know. That's not a failure. It's just the situation. He didn't look entirely convinced, but he let it go. Kraft came back in. The archive access log shows 2 events on the submission record in the last 12 hours. The first at 11:47 last night. A read access under credentials registered to an office in DOD Legal Affairs, user ID currently being traced. The second at 2:14 this morning. A restricted flag applied under credentials registered to Colonel Marcus Hargrove. Silence. Hargrove put it on himself, Emily said. Yes. Which means he didn't route it through Greer's team. He did it directly, under his own name. He either didn't realize the log was traceable at that clearance level, Osei said, or he was in a hurry. Or both, Emily said. He got the information about Osei late and moved fast and didn't stop to think about what he was leaving behind. Kraft set her phone on the table. We now have documented obstruction of a federal investigation by a DOD officer acting in coordination with the subject of that investigation. That changes the legal landscape significantly. She looked at Emily. It also means the identity verification process Greer triggered, which Hargrove would have been positioned to slow walk, is now itself under question. I'm going to escalate this to the Deputy IG this morning. Once that happens, Greer's suspension motion loses its primary sponsor inside the process. How long? Hours, not days. Kraft said it without triumph, just as logistics. But I need one more thing from you before I make that call. Emily waited. The third person who authorized the secondment. You said 2 of them were gone. Who's the third? Emily had been thinking about this since the moment Voss had said Hargrove's name in the conference room. She'd been running the calculation quietly, the way she ran most things, not avoiding it, just working through it properly before she said anything she couldn't take back. The third person was a woman named Adrienne Cole. She had been, in 2019, a senior intelligence coordinator with a joint task unit, the kind of position that existed in the space between agencies and carried authority that didn't appear on any standard organizational chart. Emily had met her exactly 4 times, twice in briefings, once in the field, and once afterward in a brief and unremarkable meeting that had functioned as a closeout debrief for the secondment. She had not spoken to Adrienne Cole since. She did not know where Adrienne Cole currently was, what position she held, or whether she had any awareness of what had been done to Emily's record in the years following. What she did know was that Adrienne Cole had been the one to tell her, at that closeout debrief, that the secondment documentation would be held at a classification level above her unit's standard records. For your protection as much as anything else, she'd said. Emily had understood that to mean operational security. She understood it differently now. Her name is Adrienne Cole, she said. She was a senior intelligence coordinator on the joint tasking. She's the only remaining person who can confirm the secondment was authorized and legitimate. Kraft wrote the name. Can she be reached? I don't know where she is now. Dolan's office might, Voss said quietly. Emily looked at him, then she looked at the table for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Dolan. He answered on the second ring. She said, Adrienne Cole, Joint Intelligence Coordination 2019. Where is she? A pause. That's a name I wasn't expecting you to have. Where is she? Another pause. Longer. She's currently serving as a deputy director in an agency I can't name on this line. She's been in that position for about 3 years. He paused again. She's also been aware of this investigation since it opened. She flagged it internally when she saw Greer's name on a background review. Emily went still. She flagged it. She has her own concerns about the secondment documentation, specifically about how it was used or not used in the period following. Did she know what happened to my record? The silence this time was the specific silence of someone choosing how much to say. She suspected, he said finally. She didn't have confirmation until Malone's affidavit surfaced through the IG's intake. Emily looked at the north-facing windows. The gray light was beginning to shift as the morning moved. Not warmer, but different, the flat quality giving way to something with slightly more texture. Can she come in today? Emily said. I'll make the call, Dolan said. Give me 30 minutes. She hung up. Kraft was watching her with the expression of someone who had been managing complex investigations for 11 years and was currently watching several separate threads converge in real time in a way she was trying to stay ahead of. Cole's testimony would directly corroborate the secondment and close Greer's AWOL fabrication entirely. Yes. And if she's been aware of the investigation, she's probably already prepared something, Emily said. She's been in intelligence coordination for 20 years. She doesn't walk into rooms unprepared. Osei quietly. Neither do you. Emily looked at her. I just mean... Osei stopped, then continued more simply. You've been ready for this for a long time. The way you walked through the clinical sequence this morning. You weren't remembering it. You've been maintaining it. Emily didn't answer that directly, because the honest answer was yes, and yes was a complicated thing to say out loud about 8 years of carrying something exact, because you understood that someday exact was going to matter. Adrienne Cole arrived at 12:40. She was 60, perhaps, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of composed authority that came from decades in rooms where most people didn't know her actual job title. She came with no assistant, no briefcase, a single tablet under her arm, and she walked into the conference room and looked at Emily for a moment before she looked at anyone else. "Carter," she said. "Cole." They didn't shake hands. It wasn't unfriendly. It was simply accurate. They were not people who performed warmth they didn't have the history to justify. Cole sat down across from Kraft, opened her tablet, and said, "I've prepared a formal statement confirming the authorization and legitimacy of the March 2019 joint tasking, with attached documentation that I've been holding in personal secure storage since 2020. I want to be clear on record that I maintained this documentation specifically because I believed it might be necessary. That was a judgment call I made after becoming aware of certain discrepancies in Carter's service file that I was not in a position to act on at the time." Kraft looked at her. "You knew there were discrepancies in her file." "I suspected. I couldn't confirm without accessing records that were outside my direct purview. I was also—" She paused, and something moved across her face that was too controlled to be quite guilt and too present to be indifference. "I was navigating my own institutional constraints. I made a decision at the time that I have since revisited." Emily watched her from across the table and said nothing. "The documentation I've brought will close the AWOL fabrication," Cole continued. "It will also establish that Colonel Hargrove was aware of the secondment authorization at the time it was issued, which means his actions in restricting the archive record this morning constitute knowing obstruction. He cannot claim the restriction was a good-faith procedural caution." Kraft looked at her records. "You anticipated Hargrove's involvement." "I anticipated that if Greer was moving to suppress this investigation, he would need someone inside the documentation infrastructure. Hargrove was the logical candidate. They've had a professional relationship for 15 years. Cole set her tablet down. "I want to say something for the record." "Go ahead," Kraft said. Cole looked at Emily. "What was done to your record was wrong. What was allowed to stand in the years following through silence and institutional convenience was also wrong. I can provide documentation and testimony, and I'm prepared to do that fully. I can't undo the time. I'm not going to pretend those are equivalent things." Emily looked at her steadily for a long moment. "I know they're not," she said. It was not forgiveness, and it was not the absence of it. It was simply a statement of where they were, and Cole received it as such, with a brief nod, and then a return to the practical work, which was the most honest thing either of them could do. By 3 in the afternoon, the deputy IG had been briefed and had issued an emergency administrative hold on Greer's suspension motion, pending a review of Hargrove's obstruction. By 4, Hargrove's credentials had been suspended, and a federal agent had been dispatched to his office. By 4:45, the identity verification process Greer had triggered was formally closed. Emily Carter's identity confirmed, her service record flagged for formal review and correction. Greer's legal team filed 3 separate motions between 2 and 5 o'clock, each one addressed within the hour by Kraft's expanded team, which now included 2 additional attorneys from the Deputy IG's office who worked with the contained efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Emily sat in the conference room through most of it, answering questions when she was needed, staying out of the way when she wasn't. She drank 2 cups of bad coffee and ate half a sandwich that someone's assistant had brought in at some point. Her phone had 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, which she ignored, and 2 from Donna, which she also ignored for now. Voss came and went twice. He was making calls of his own, quietly, in the hallway. At 5:30, Kraft sat down across from Emily for the first time in several hours without anything in her hands. No phone, no notepad, nothing. Just sitting. Greer was informed at 4:15 that the investigation is proceeding under expanded oversight and that his advisory appointment has been formally suspended pending outcome, she said. His legal team is still filing, but they're filing defensive motions now, trying to limit exposure, not suppress the case. He stopped trying to win, Emily said. He's trying to manage the damage. Kraft paused. His attorney issued a statement at 5 o'clock, claiming that Greer stands by the integrity of the original mission report and that any discrepancies are the result of administrative errors in the chain of documentation. Administrative errors. Yes. Emily looked at the table. And Hargrove? His attorney has not yet issued a statement. Our agent found him in his office and he's been cooperative, which means he's calculating that cooperation is his best option right now. Kraft paused. He gave a preliminary statement that Greer's team had approached him in September with concerns about the investigation and that he had, in his words, provided guidance within the scope of his authority. Guidance, Emily said. Yes. That's a sophisticated way of describing obstruction. His attorney will make it sound better than that. Our attorneys will make it sound worse. That's how it goes. Kraft looked at her directly. The formal record correction is in process. The citation restoration will take longer. There's a military honors review board that has to convene. But the deputy IG has flagged it for expedited review. Weeks, not months. Emily absorbed that. Weeks. After 8 years, weeks was a strange unit of time to be working with. The men from the extraction, she said. Malone, Rivas, the others. Malone knows the investigation is proceeding. He's been updated. Kraft paused. Rivas has been contacted. He wants to speak to you. Emily looked at the window. The afternoon light had finally achieved something approaching warmth, or at least the suggestion of it. The low October sun coming through at an angle that made the room look briefly less like a government conference space and more like somewhere people could simply exist. I'll call him, she said. There's one more thing, Kraft said. Emily looked at her. Greer's attorney, in the course of their defensive filing this afternoon, submitted a document they claim was prepared by Greer in 2019 as an internal memorandum. It's framed as a good faith record of his concerns about the medical decisions made during the extraction. They're trying to establish that his removal of your name from the record was a documented internal decision, not a cover-up, that he had recorded concerns about clinical protocols and was managing them through unofficial channels. The Pruitt strategy, Emily said, in document form. Yes. Did they file it with the full clinical sequence attached? Partial. They attached a summary of the Rivas case without the patient presentation detail. Then they don't have Osei's addendum. If they had it, they'd know the patient presentation detail dismantles the memorandum entirely. Kraft nodded. Which means when the addendum is retrieved from the archive, his own protective document becomes the evidence that proves he knew the full clinical picture and filed a partial account anyway. Emily paused. That's not administrative error. That's deliberate falsification. Yes, Kraft said. That's what we'll argue. She leaned back. Carter, I need to ask you something that's not in the official record. Emily waited. Greer filed that memorandum in 2019, a year after the extraction. He'd already buried your name. He'd already built his version of events. Why did he write the memorandum at all? Emily had thought about this. She'd actually been thinking about it since the moment Kraft described it, the question running quietly alongside everything else. Because something happened in 2019 that made him think the record might be opened, she said. Something that scared him enough to start building defensive documentation. What happened in 2019? Emily looked at Kraft steadily. Malone tried to file a complaint, she said, not the affidavit, something earlier. An informal complaint through his unit's JAG officer. It didn't go anywhere. The JAG officer referred it upward and it died in the chain of command. But Greer found out about it. Kraft stared at her. You knew about the informal complaint. Malone told me. In a letter, 2020. She paused. I didn't respond to the letter because I thought responding would pull him back into something he'd already risked enough on. I thought it had been handled and closed. She paused again. I was wrong. Kraft looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite judgment and had the particular weight of someone understanding fully and finally the complete shape of a thing they'd been working with in pieces. The JAG officer who received Malone's complaint, Kraft said carefully. Do you know who that was? Emily looked at her. His name was in the letter, she said. I've been thinking about it all afternoon. Carter. The JAG officer's name, Emily said, was Hargrove. Kraft went absolutely still. The room was very quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence of sound, but presence of something else. The specific density of a moment in which a case that had seemed to have a ceiling had just had the ceiling removed, and the space above it was larger and more complicated and considerably more damaging to the people who had thought the ceiling would hold. He buried Malone's complaint, Kraft said. And then he called Greer, Emily said. And then Greer wrote the memorandum. She paused. They've been working together since 2019 at minimum. Hargrove isn't a late addition to this. He's been in it from the second Malone tried to surface the truth. Kraft picked up her phone. I need the deputy IG back on the line, she said to whoever answered. Right now. And I need a federal holding order on Colonel Hargrove, not suspended credentials, an actual hold. Tonight. She stood and walked out of the room, phone to her ear, voice dropping into the crisp, controlled register of someone who had just shifted from investigation to prosecution. Emily sat at the table in the emptied conference room. Ose was packing her tablet. Voss was in the hallway. The light through the window had gone fully gold now, the last of the afternoon before dark, and it made the room look almost gentle. Ose paused at the door. You doing okay? Emily thought about the honest answer. She thought about the specific quality of the last 18 hours. The motel rooms, the calls, the sessions in this room, the way the thing had moved from something she'd been holding alone for 8 years to something that was now proceeding under its own momentum, larger than she was, pulling everything connected to it into motion. I don't know yet, she said, which was true. Ose nodded. That's the right answer. She paused. For what it's worth, I'm glad you called. She left. Emily sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes, which was all she allowed herself. Then she picked up her phone and found the number she'd saved from Kraft's earlier communication, the contact forwarded from Malone's attorney, and pressed call. It rang 4 times. Carter? The voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low, steady, the quality of someone who chose words carefully because he'd learned that words had weight. Malone, she said. A pause. Not awkward. Just the pause of 2 people who had a great deal of history and very little practice talking to each other. How are you holding up? He said. I'll let you know when I figure it out. She paused. The investigation is moving. Kraft has what she needs. Hargrove is being held tonight. She heard his breath shift, a small release that was not quite relief and was something more complicated. And Greer? He's defensive now, trying to limit the damage. She looked at the last of the gold light on the wall. He's not going to be able to. Good, Malone said. Just that. Simple and flat, and carrying 8 years in it. I got your letter, she said. The 2021. I never responded. I know. I'm sorry. A pause. Don't be. I understood. He was quiet for a moment. I should have done more, sooner. I told myself I was protecting what little I'd already put on record. Really, I was just... He stopped. It's easier to carry something that's already settled than to pick it back up. I know, she said. They were both quiet for a moment, 2 people who understood that particular weight from the inside without needing to explain it to each other. The investigation goes formal next week, she said. Kraft's team will need your deposition on record. The full version, not just the affidavit. I'll be there. And Malone. She paused. Rivas. What's his status? Physically. He's good. Runs 3 miles every morning. A pause. On both legs. Emily pressed her thumb against the edge of the table. Okay, she said. Good. She hung up and sat for 1 more minute in the quiet room. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway, fast and deliberate, and Kraft pushed the door open without knocking, which was the first time she'd done that all day. And her face had something on it that was not the controlled professional register Emily had been reading all day. It was urgency, clean and undisguised. Greer just fired his entire legal team, Kraft said, 10 minutes ago, across the board. All of them. Emily looked at her. That's not damage management. No, Kraft said. It's not. People fire their lawyers when they're about to do something their lawyers told them not to do. Yes. Kraft looked at her steadily. We don't know yet what that is, but his personal phone has gone dark, and his residential address shows no activity on the building's security system since 3 o'clock this afternoon, which is 2 hours before he was formally notified of the expanded investigation. Emily stood up. "He ran," she said. "We don't know that for certain." "He ran," Emily said again, and her voice was flat and absolute, because she knew the specific calculation that led to that decision. She'd run it herself once, 8 years ago, for different reasons, and she recognized its shape exactly. Kraft's phone rang again. She answered it. Listened for 7 seconds. Her face went very still. "When?" she said. A pause. "Lock it down," she said, and hung up. She looked at Emily. "Greer made one phone call before his phone went dark," she said. "We pulled the number. It's a cell registered to a private address in Bar Harbor, Maine." She paused. 40 miles north of Seabrook. Emily felt something go cold and precise in her chest. "He's not running from the investigation," Kraft said. "He's running toward something." She paused. "The address in Bar Harbor is registered to a woman named Donna Paris." Emily stared at her. Donna, who had handed her her coat, who had said, "Be careful out there, it's going to rain," who had been running the Anchor House Grill for 11 years, in the town Emily Carter had chosen carefully, precisely, and had allowed herself to believe, that no one could have predicted. "How long has she been there?" Emily said, her voice very quiet. "Unknown, but if Greer called her before he went dark..." "She's not a hostage," Emily said, because she'd already worked through the logic, the way logic worked when you'd spent years in environments where people used the thing you didn't expect. "She's a contact. He has a contact in Seabrook." She paused. "He's been watching me for longer than 48 hours. Kraft was already dialing, and Emily was already moving toward the door because the thing she had spent 8 years maintaining, the quiet, the distance, the accommodation with a wound that had healed wrong, had just become irrelevant, and what was left was something older and considerably more direct. Kraft was 3 steps behind her and already talking into her phone, coordinating with the federal agent assigned to Bar Harbor, pulling resources that would take time to move because resources always took time to move, and time was the one thing Emily was not currently willing to negotiate with. She hit the hallway at a pace that wasn't running, but was the thing just before running. Controlled, direct, the kind of movement that covered ground without announcing itself. Voss was in the hallway. He read her face in approximately 1 second. "What happened?" "Greer has a contact in Seabrook. Someone close to me. He called her before he went dark." She kept moving. "I need your keys." "Emily, Harlan, your keys." He didn't argue. He pulled them from his jacket pocket and held them out, and she took them without breaking stride, and he fell in behind her because he understood, as she did, that the conversation about whether this was a good idea was going to happen after, not before. Kraft's voice followed them down the hallway. "Carter, federal agents are already en route to Bar Harbor. Do not..." "I'm not going to Bar Harbor," Emily said. "He's not there yet. He made the call from here, which means he's still moving, which means he's on the road north and he won't reach Bar Harbor for at least another 40 minutes. She pushed the stairwell door open. "I'm going to Seabrook." "Why Seabrook?" "Because Donna Paris doesn't live in Bar Harbor. She lives 4 blocks from the Anchor House, and she was at that restaurant until at least 9:30 last night, which means if Greer called her from Portland this afternoon, he wasn't calling her at home in Bar Harbor. He was calling the number on file, and whoever gave him that number gave him the address on record, not where she actually is." She took the stairs at speed, Voss right behind her. "She's in Seabrook, and if Greer figured out I didn't go home last night, he knows I'll come back." Kraft's voice, now through Voss's phone because he'd put it on speaker. "This is not how this works. You are a witness in an active federal..." "Call the Seabrook PD," Emily said. "Tell them to put someone on Donna Paris at her residential address. Tell them not to engage Greer if he arrives. Observe and hold. And tell them a federal witness is en route and will make contact on arrival." A pause on the line. Then, with the compression of someone who had assessed the situation and decided this was faster than the alternative. "Copy that. Go." Voss's car was a 10-year-old Volvo that smelled like old coffee and had a passenger seat full of folders she shoved to the floor. She drove. He didn't protest that either, which told her more about his read of the situation than anything he could have said. The coast road north was 40 minutes in normal conditions, and she made it in 31, which required some decisions she didn't explain and Voss didn't ask about. The October dark had come fully down by now, the road cutting through stands of pine and occasional stretches of open water on the left that caught the last of the sky's light and held it briefly before the road curved away. She thought about Donna while she drove. The question of how long and how deep and what the nature of it actually was. These were things she didn't have answers to yet and was disciplining herself not to assume. Donna had worked that restaurant for 11 years. Emily had been there for 14 months. The overlap was recent, and Donna's manner toward her had always read as straightforward, the uncomplicated practicality of a woman who ran a business and managed people without a great deal of sentimentality. But Greer had called her, which meant either Donna had been placed in Seabrook deliberately before Emily arrived, in which case the 14 months had been a surveillance operation so patient and so ordinary that Emily, who was not an ordinary person when it came to reading environments, had missed it completely. Or Donna was someone Greer knew independently, who had recognized Emily at some point and made a call, and had been passing information in the background of a relationship that Emily had experienced as unremarkable employment. Both possibilities were bad. The second one was worse, in a specific way she couldn't quite articulate and didn't try to. She turned off the coast road into Seabrook at 6:15. The harbor lights were on. The street in front of the anchor house was half lit and mostly empty, the restaurant sign on, but the parking lot thinner than a Tuesday evening would normally produce. She drove past without stopping. Donna's address was something she knew because she'd given Donna her own address when she'd filled out the employment paperwork. And in the way of small-town workplaces, addresses got exchanged, referenced, casually mentioned. Donna lived in a gray Cape Cod 3 blocks north of the restaurant, with a porch light that was on a timer and a Honda CR-V in the driveway. That was the same car Emily had seen in the restaurant lot 100 times. She parked on the street 2 houses down. "Stay in the car," she said to Voss. "Emily, I'm not asking you to stay out of it. I'm asking you to stay where you can see the street and call Kraft if Greer's vehicle appears." She looked at him. "I need someone watching the approach." He held her gaze for a moment. "You don't know what you're walking into." "No," she agreed. "But I know Donna, and she doesn't know that I know about the call. And if Greer isn't here yet, the conversation I need to have with her is better without a retired admiral in the room." He accepted that. She got out. The air was cold and salt-heavy, the same as it always was in Seabrook at this hour, and she walked up the porch steps and knocked. Donna opened the door after a long enough pause that Emily registered it. She was dressed in her off-shift clothes, jeans, a fleece pullover, reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at Emily and something moved across her face, fast and complicated, the expression of someone who had been expecting a version of this and was still not prepared for the actual version. "Emily," she said, "can I come in?" A pause. "Yeah, sure." She stepped back. The house was the way Emily would have expected from Donna. Functional. A little cluttered in the way of someone who lived alone and had stopped performing tidiness, books on every surface, a television on mute in the corner. It smelled like microwave dinner and something herbal. Emily stood in the middle of the living room and looked at her. "He called you this afternoon," Emily said. Donna went very still. The reading glasses slid down from her head and she caught them by reflex and held them in her hand. "I don't know what—" "Donna." Her voice was quiet. Not angry, just precise. "I'm not here to make this worse than it is. I need to know what he told you and what you told him." The silence was long enough to be its own kind of answer. "I didn't know who you were," Donna said finally. Her voice had changed, the brisk managerial register gone, replaced by something rawer and less defended. "Not at first. He asked me to look out for a woman matching your description who might turn up looking for work somewhere in the coastal area. That was before you got here, 14 months before. He placed you in Seabrook." "No, I was already here. I'd been running the restaurant for 9 years when he called me. We'd known each other, a long time ago. He had something on me." She stopped. "Doesn't matter what." "It might matter legally," Emily said. "I know." Donna looked at the glasses in her hand. He asked me to let him know if anyone matching your description turned up. I didn't ask why. I told myself I didn't need to know why. She stopped again. That was easier to tell myself before I actually met you. Emily looked at her. The complicated thing about this, the specifically human and inconvenient thing, was that she believed her. Not completely, not without reservation, but in the essential shape of it, a woman who had agreed to something she hadn't fully understood, and then spent 14 months working beside the person she'd been asked to watch, and had found it increasingly difficult to locate the version of herself that had said yes. When you recognized me, Emily said, how long did you wait before you called him? Donna's jaw tightened. 3 weeks. And tonight's call. He called me. This afternoon. Said something had changed and asked if you'd been at work today. She paused. I told him no. That was all I told him. That was enough. I know. Her voice was very flat. I know it was. Emily stood there for a moment in the living room of a woman she'd worked beside for over a year and thought about the geometry of it. The way surveillance worked not through dramatic deception, but through ordinary adjacency, through the unremarkable daily proximity of a workplace, through the 11 years of a life that made Donna Paris part of the furniture of a town, invisible because familiar. She thought about what Donna had said. He had something on me. She thought about the fact that Donna had told him Emily hadn't been at work, which was true, but was also the minimum information that wouldn't actively help him, which was a small thing but was not nothing. He's coming here, Emily said. Donna looked up sharply. Here? Seabrook. He went dark after your call. He fired his lawyers. He's on the road. She held Donna's gaze. I need you to call him back. What? Call him back. Tell him you were wrong. That you saw my car in the restaurant lot, that you think I came back to work the dinner shift. Give him a reason to come to the restaurant instead of here. She paused. Federal agents are already in position. Local police have the residential addresses covered. I need him in a location where he can be contained without... She looked at the house around them, the books and the muted television and the microwave still warm on the counter. Without this. Donna stared at her for a long moment. Why would you trust me to do that? She said, after everything I just told you. Emily thought about the honest answer. I don't entirely, she said, but I think you're someone who made a bad decision a long time ago and has been living inside it, and I think you're trying to figure out how much of it you can undo. She paused. This is the thing you can undo. Donna looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her phone. Down. Marcus Greer arrived at the Anchor House parking lot at 7:48, which Emily knew because Voss was relaying updates from his phone in the passenger seat of the Volvo where she'd told him to stay, and where he had in fact stayed. She was at the end of the block, on foot, watching the lot from the corner of the building's shadow. He came in a rental car, dark blue, nondescript, the choice of someone trying to move without being marked. He sat in the lot for 2 minutes without getting out, which she'd expected. He was assessing, checking the exterior, the light patterns, the cars. He would not find anything that told him this was anything other than what Donna had described. She watched him get out of the car. He was 61, heavier than the service photo she'd found in the public record, with the particular posture of a man who had spent decades being certain he was the most important person in any room and had recently learned that certainty was not the same as security. He wore a dark jacket and moved with the residual bearing of someone who had commanded men, the muscle memory of authority that didn't disappear when the authority did. She stayed in the shadow. The federal agents moved first, from 2 positions she'd been told about, but hadn't been able to identify herself, which was professionally reassuring. Clean, fast, coordinated. 2 at the car, 1 at his left, the 4th at the entry point behind him before he'd taken 6 steps from the rental. She heard the words federal agents and do not move and hands where we can see them in the particular flat professional register of people who had done this before. And she watched Marcus Greer stop walking and stand very still in the parking lot of the Anchor House Grill in Seabrook, Maine, with his hands coming up slowly and the light from the restaurant sign falling across him in the thin coastal dark. He didn't look around wildly. He didn't shout. He stood there with his hands raised and his jaw set, with what might, from a distance, have looked like dignity. She came out of the shadow. She didn't plan to. She told herself she would stay at the perimeter, that there was nothing she needed to see directly, that the operational outcome was what mattered, and not the specific geography of how she stood in relation to it. But her feet moved, and she came out of the shadow and crossed the edge of the parking lot, and one of the agents put a hand up briefly and then lowered it when she identified herself, and she stopped about 15 feet from Greer. He looked at her. 8 years was not so long, she found, when it was compressed into the distance between two people in a parking lot. He looked older. She probably did too. The things that had happened in those 8 years were present in the air between them in a way that didn't require words to establish. "Carter," he said. She looked at him and said nothing. There was a version of this scene she'd imagined over the years, in the occasional late-night hours when imagination ran ahead of discipline. A version where she said something exact and devastating, where she named each specific lie with the clinical precision she'd applied to everything else, where she reduced 8 years of his architecture to its actual components in front of people who could see them clearly. She found, standing there, that she didn't want to. Not because she'd forgiven him, she hadn't, and she wasn't going to perform something she didn't feel because the scene seemed to call for it. But the things she would have said, she had already said, in that conference room, on the record, in exact clinical sequence, with documentation and witnesses and a federal record that would outlast both of them. She had said them where they counted. Here, in the parking lot, with his hands in the air, there was nothing left to establish. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to the Volvo. The formal charges were filed 9 days later. Marcus Greer, falsification of military records, obstruction of justice, fraud in connection with federal employment, and conduct unbecoming an officer, the last of which carried its own particular weight in the specific circles where weight like that still mattered. His advisory appointment was revoked permanently. His military honors, awarded in part on the basis of the 2018 mission report, were under formal review by a board that Kraft described, in her characteristic understatement, as not inclined toward leniency. Colonel Hargrove was charged separately: obstruction of a federal investigation, abuse of official position, and conspiracy. He had cooperated, as Kraft had predicted, which would reduce his exposure without eliminating it. He had confirmed in his formal statement that he had buried Malone's 2019 complaint and had alerted Greer to the IG investigation in September. He had also confirmed that Greer had approached him first, that the relationship between them had been transactional for years, a quiet exchange of favors and protections that had operated in the background of both their careers, invisible because it was ordinary. That word stayed with Emily. Ordinary. The machinery of the cover-up had not been dramatic. It had been a phone call here and a flagged record there, and a JAG officer who let a complaint die in the chain of command, and a mission report that simply arranged the facts in a different order. It had been the accumulated weight of small decisions made by people who understood institutional gravity and used it. She thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed. Donna Paris gave a voluntary statement to federal investigators that detailed the nature of Greer's contact and the information she'd passed. She was not charged. Cooperation, extenuating circumstances, and the specific nature of what Greer had held over her, which turned out to involve a decade-old financial irregularity in a previous business that Greer had documented and kept. The statement was sealed at her attorney's request. Emily did not ask to see it. Donna did not return to the Anchor House. She resigned the week after and left Seabrook, and Emily did not see her again, and found that she could hold the complexity of that, the genuine harm alongside the genuine circumstances, without resolving it into something simpler than it was. The military record correction came through on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the conference room. Kraft called her directly, which she didn't have to do, but did. "It's done," she said. "Your official service record has been corrected to reflect your participation in the 2018 extraction, your medical role, and the specific interventions that were previously omitted. The citation has been formally restored." A pause. "Your name is back in the record, Carter. Exactly where it should have been." Emily was sitting at her kitchen table in the apartment with the knocking radiator and the bathroom door that didn't fully close. She had not yet found somewhere else to live. She hadn't decided whether she was going to. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. You did the work." She almost said something else. She let it go. What happens to Osei's addendum? It's been integrated into the official clinical record of the extraction. Dr. Osei has been formally recognized as a contributing documenter. A brief pause. She seemed pleased about that in a very controlled way. "That sounds right," Emily said. "The Honors Review Board convenes in 3 weeks. I don't anticipate a difficult outcome." Another pause. "One more thing. Rivas asked me to pass something along. He said, and I'm reading directly from the message, 'Tell her I run 3 miles every morning and I'm slow as hell, but I'm doing it.'" Emily pressed her thumb hard against the edge of the table. The wood was still nicked from someone else's life, and her thumb found the same notch it always found when she sat here, worn familiar by now. "Tell him that's the news I needed," she said. She called Malone the following evening. They talked for an hour, which was the longest either of them had spoken to the other in any iteration of their history. He was in Baton Rouge. His daughter was 12 now. He had a dog he hadn't mentioned in the letter, a large, anxious shepherd mix he'd gotten from a shelter 2 years ago, and described with the particular tolerant affection of a man who had not expected to become a dog person. "She chews everything," he said. "Destroyed 2 pairs of boots." "Sounds right for the type," Emily said. "Yeah." A pause. "I've been thinking about something." "Okay." "You spent 8 years not pushing on this. And I spent 8 years doing the same thing, more or less. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but mostly I was just not doing it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think either of us were wrong, exactly. But I think maybe we were waiting for permission that was never going to come from outside." Emily thought about that, about the specific quality of what he was describing, the way people who had spent years in institutions learned to look to those institutions for the signal that it was time to move, and sometimes that signal didn't come, and you had to decide whether to move anyway. "No," she said. "It wasn't going to come from outside." "A retired admiral walking into a bar in Maine," Malone said, "a tray falling on the floor." A pause. Of all the things, she agreed. The ceremony was private, as she'd requested. A small room in a federal building in D.C., 8 people present, including Kraft and Voss and Osei and Malone, who had driven up from Baton Rouge because he'd said he wasn't going to miss it, and meant it. 2 representatives from the Military Honors Office and a general who had not been involved in any of what happened before, and who read the restoration citation in a straightforward, unperformative way that she found she appreciated more than any other delivery would have offered. Afterward, in the hallway, Malone stood next to her for a moment without saying anything. Then, "You good?" She thought about it. The question deserved a real answer. "I don't know if good is the word," she said, "but I know where I am now. That's different from 8 years ago." He nodded. "Yeah." Voss found her near the exit, pulling on his coat. "There's something I want to say," he said, "and I want to say it before the moment passes." She waited. "I spent 40 years in institutions," he said. "I believe in institutions. I think they're necessary, and I think they mostly work. But I watched this one fail you in a way that institutions aren't supposed to fail people. And I watched it happen because of small decisions made by small men who understood the machinery and used it." He paused. "I don't know how to account for that exactly. I just wanted to say that I see it." Emily looked at him for a moment. This was the man who had walked into a bar in Maine and looked at a tattoo and stayed at the bar for a club soda, and the chain of events from that Tuesday night to this hallway felt, in this moment, genuinely improbable, in a way she didn't have a framework for that didn't involve some faith in something she wasn't sure she had. "You came in at the right time," she said. "That counts." He put out his hand. She shook it. 3 months later, she started a new position, not one she'd been offered so much as one she'd built from a conversation with Osei, who had turned out to have both the institutional connections and the specific frustration with the existing training gap to make something like it possible. a curriculum development role at a civilian trauma training center outside of Portland, working with medical personnel headed into austere or conflict environments. Exactly the people who would, at some point, be standing where she'd stood, making calls the textbook didn't quite cover, and windows the planning hadn't anticipated. She was not the most comfortable teacher. She said so in the first session, to a room of 12 people who looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism. "I'm going to tell you things I've learned," she said, "and some of them are going to be things I learned by getting them wrong first. I'll tell you which is which." She looked around the room. "What I won't do is make it sound cleaner than it was. The cases that matter are never clean." A woman in the second row, late 20s, the direct-eyed look of someone who'd been through enough already to stop performing confidence she didn't feel, raised her hand. "What do you do when the protocol doesn't fit the patient?" Emily looked at her. "You use everything you actually know," she said, "and you accept the weight of the decision, and you document everything so thoroughly that the truth has somewhere to live, even if the record doesn't cooperate with it right away." She paused. "The record can be corrected. The patient in front of you cannot be paused." The woman wrote something down. Emily looked at the room and thought briefly and without indulgence about all of it. The restaurant, and the tray, and the tattoo, and the parking lot, and the cold Maine dark, and the conference room, and Malone's dog, and Rivas running 3 miles every morning slowly. She thought about Donna and what it meant to agree to a small thing that became a large thing, and she thought about Hargrove and what it meant to protect one person's lie long enough that the lie became load-bearing, and she thought about Marcus Greer standing in a parking lot with his hands in the air, and the specific inadequacy of that image to contain everything that had led to it. She thought about what Malone had said, waiting for permission that was never going to come from outside. She had been waiting, in her own way. For 8 years she had been maintaining, keeping the facts exact, keeping the wound from pressing, keeping herself small enough to stay undetected. And she had told herself that was patience, and sometimes it was, and sometimes it was something less useful than patience. What she understood now, standing at the front of a room of 12 people who were going to go out and make hard calls in bad windows, was that the record had been restored not because the institutions finally functioned correctly on their own. It had been restored because people chose to move without waiting. Malone with his affidavit, Osei with her submission number she'd kept for 5 years, Voss with a club soda in a bar at the edge of the country, herself in a parking lot with a phone that said, "He's trying to make me the story." Nobody had done it cleanly. Nobody had done it without cost. That was the thing she wanted to say to the room, and she found the words for it without trying too hard, which was usually the sign that something was true. "You're going to make decisions that can't be fully explained until afterward," she said. "Sometimes not until years afterward. That doesn't mean the decision was wrong. It means the situation was real." She looked at the woman in the second row. "Document everything. Stay exact. And do not let someone else's account of what happened become the one that stands. Not because you need credit, but because the truth has to live somewhere, and sometimes you're the only one who can give it the room." The woman in the second row looked at her for a moment. "How do you know when to push?" she said. Emily thought about a tray hitting a floor at 7:14 on a Tuesday night, about a sleeve rolling up at exactly the wrong moment, about a retired admiral who had stayed at the bar and ordered a club soda instead of walking out, and the entire improbable weight of everything that had followed from those 3 consecutive accidents of circumstance. "You push," she said, "when the cost of staying still finally outweighs the cost of moving." She looked around the room. "And you'll know when that is," she said. "Not because someone tells you, because you've been paying attention."